I have mended clocks for 31 years, and a clockmaker learns to read the small signs that tell him a thing is well made before he ever opens the case. The way a man stands is one of those signs. So when I tell you that I knew Merc Halloran for a soldier the moment I laid eyes on him at the Vane Gate, you may take it as the judgment of a man who has spent his life looking closely at how things are built and how they hold their shape under strain. I did not know his name that morning. I did not know his rank. I knew only that the still figure in the red tunic and the tall black cap was not a decoration, whatever the crowd around me believed, and that the men who mistook him for one were going to be sorry for it before the bells rang noon. I had come up to the capital from Edgerton on a slow train the night before, with a brass regulator movement wrapped in flannel in my case, bound for a buyer near the cathedral who paid well for honest work and asked no questions about the years it had taken me to learn it. My business was done by 9. I am 63 years old, my knees are no friends of mine, and I had a long afternoon before my train home, so I did what any old man does in a strange city with time to spend. I went to look at something grand. The grandest thing in Corvith that morning was the Vane Court, the great paved forecourt before Ravensmoor Palace, because it was an investiture day, and half the city had come to stand at the rails and watch the carriages roll in. You will not have seen the Vane Court unless you have been to Corvith, so let me set it for you. It is a wide square of pale stone laid in a fan pattern, bounded on 3 sides by gilded iron railings tall as a man, and on the 4th by the long gray face of the palace itself, with the Vane Gate set in the middle of it, a deep archway of carved stone flanked by 2 sentry posts, where the King's RoyalGuard stand their watch. On an ordinary day there are 2 guardsmen there and a thin scatter of onlookers. On an investiture morning there were 8, 4 to each side of the arch, and a crowd 6 deep at the rails, and footmen in palace livery moving about with the importance of men who have been told the day matters. The light was very clean. It had rained in the night and the stones were still dark at their edges, and the sun came over the eastern wing and lit the whole court the color of new bread. The guardsmen wore the full ceremonial dress of the RoyalGuard, the deep red wool tunic with its double row of brass buttons polished to small suns, the white crossbelt, the white gloves, the row of metal ribbons across the breast, and the tall black cap of bear's fur that they call the sable in Corvith, with the leather chin strap drawn down hard against the jaw. Each man carried a rifle, grounded by his right foot, the bayonet not fixed but the long blade riding in its scabbard at his hip. They stood as the RoyalGuard are trained to stand, which is to say they did not stand the way you or I stand when we are trying to hold still. There is a difference. A man holding still is fighting his own body, and you can see the fight in him, the small sway, the shift of weight, the swallow. These men were not fighting anything. They had simply set themselves down inside their own discipline and gone quiet there, the way a well-balanced wheel goes quiet when it finds its true center and stops fighting the spindle. It is a beautiful thing to watch if you have an eye for it. Most of the crowd did not. Most of the crowd looked at them the way you look at a statue or a fine clock face, which is to say they admired the surface and never once thought there was a man inside doing the hardest work in the square. I found a place at the rail near the right-hand sentry post where I could lean my bad knee against the iron and rest. And that is how I came to be standing not 8 feet from the man whose name I would not learn until the king himself spoke it. He was on the inner end of the right rank, nearest the arch, the senior position, though I did not know to read it as such then. He was not a young man. The other 7 were in their 20s and early 30s, smooth-faced and proud, the way young soldiers are proud when they have polished themselves to a shine and know the whole city is looking. He was older, 50 perhaps, or near it. His face under the cap was weathered in the way that does not come from weather alone. There was a line down the left side of his jaw, an old white seam of scar that the chin strap pressed across, and the skin around his eyes was creased deep, not from laughing. His back was as straight as the railings. His gloved hands were folded one over the other on the muzzle of the grounded rifle, perfectly still, and his eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance that was nowhere and everywhere. The soldier's far stare that takes in the whole field without resting on any part of it. I have stood in ranks. I was a line sergeant in the Vale River campaign in the bad years, and though I never rose past sergeant and never did anything in those years that anyone would put on a medal, I learned what the front rank looks like when the men in it have been somewhere. There is a particular economy in it. Nothing wasted. No flourish. The young men beside him stood beautifully, but they stood for the crowd. He stood as though the crowd were not there at all, as though he had stood through worse than a crowd, and a crowd was the least of what a man might be asked to stand through. I looked at him for a long time and I thought that one has carried a real weight, and he is not carrying it for show. The carriages began to arrive a little before 10. They came up the long avenue from the city and turned in through the side lane, and the footmen handed down the morning's honored guests, who were to be invested that day into the various orders of the kingdom. There is a whole architecture of these honors in Corvus, as there is in any old kingdom, orders of merit and orders of service and orders of valor, each with its ribbon and its ceremony and its strict ladder of who may be admitted and how. The crowd cheered the carriages in a loose, good-natured way, the way a crowd will cheer anything that arrives in style on a fine morning. The carriage that mattered to this story arrived last of the early lot, and it arrived loudly. It was a great glossy black thing with too much brass on it, drawn by 4 matched grays, and the man who got down from it got down the way some men do, slowly, so that everyone would have time to see him do it. He was perhaps 50 himself, broad in the chest and broader in the belly, in a coat of dark blue cut very fine, with a heavy gold chain across the front of it, and rings on the hand he used to wave off the footman who tried to help him down. His face was full and red and pleased with itself. He had the look of a man who has spent the back half of his life being agreed with, and who has come to mistake the agreement for the truth. I learned his name within the minute because he made sure I would. He stood a moment on the stones, drew a breath, and announced to the footman, to the air, to the whole rail of us, "Baron Drain, the Baron Calloway Drain, I am expected." He said it the way a man says a word he has only lately been given and is still in love with the Baron, rolling it like a coin on his tongue. I would learn the rest of it from the talk along the rail over the next half hour. That Drain was foundry money and railway money, a man who had built half the iron in the eastern provinces and bought the title with a fraction of what he had left over, and that he had come up that morning to be admitted into the Order of the Sable Cross. There was a good deal of murmuring about that last part. The Sable Cross, an old woman beside me said with her mouth pinched tight, was not a thing you bought. It was the kingdom's highest honor for valor, and the order that bore its name was meant to be the company of the men who had earned it and the families of the men who had died earning it. There had been changes in recent years, she said. Patrons admitted, benefactors, men whose money had built the order's almshouses and pensions and who were rewarded with a seat among the brave. She did not approve. I did not have an opinion yet. I had only the man in front of me, swelling on the stones in his fine blue coat, waiting to be made one of the valiant. He did not wait well. The footman had told him, I gathered, that he must wait in the court until the chamberlain came to bring his party in, and Baron Drain was a man unused to waiting in any court for anything. He paced. He pulled out a heavy gold watch and snapped it open and shut. He spoke too loudly to the 2 younger men of his party, a son, I think, and a secretary, about the disgraceful delay. About how a man of his consequence should not be left standing in the open like a tradesman. And then, because the inner end of the right sentry post was the nearest fixed point to where the chamberlain would come out, he walked over to it, to the arch, to the place where Merc Halloran stood his watch, and he made the guardsman the object of his impatience. It began small, the way these things do. He stopped in front of Halloran and looked him up and down the way you would look over a horse you were thinking of not buying. "You," he said, "how long does your chamberlain mean to keep me standing?" A guardsman of the RoyalGuard on ceremonial duty does not answer questions from the public. He is not permitted to. He is a fixed point, The whole meaning of him is that he does not move and does not speak, that he is the still center the ceremony turns around. Halloran did not answer. His eyes did not so much as flick down to the man in front of him. He stood as he had stood before, the gloved hands folded on the muzzle, the far stare, the straight back. Drain did not understand it. I watched him not understand it. He was a man for whom the world answered when spoken to, and here was a thing in a red coat that did not answer, and he took the silence not for discipline but for insolence, or worse, for stupidity. "Are you deaf?" he said louder so the rail could hear. "I asked you a question. I should think a man could manage a civil answer to a baron." A laugh went around his little party. The son smirked. The crowd at the rail had begun to watch now, the way a crowd will, drawn to the small disturbance the way iron filings turn to a magnet. Halloran said nothing. He did nothing. The far stare held. "Look at it," Drain said to his son, jerking his chin at the guardsman. "Stuffed and painted and put out front to impress the tourists. A palace ornament. There's no more in there than in the gatepost." He said it as a joke and his party laughed at it as a joke, and I felt the heat come up the back of my own neck because I had been a soldier and I knew what was in there, and I could not say a word because I was nobody and it was not my place. An ornament. He had looked at the straightest back in the square and the deepest creased eyes and the white seam of an old wound down the jaw, and he had decided there was nothing in it but stuffing. That is the thing about a man like Drain. He cannot read the signs because he has never had to. The world has always rearranged itself to flatter him, and so he has never learned to look at a thing and find out what it truly is. He looks at a thing and finds out what it is to him. To Calloway Drain, the man at the gate was a delay and a prop and an audience for his wit. He had no eyes for what the man actually was. I want to tell you what Halloran did in that minute because it is the heart of the whole thing, and it is the part the crowd at the rail could not see and I, who had stood in ranks myself, could. He did nothing. That is what he did, and it was the hardest thing in the square. A young soldier would have colored. A young soldier would have set his jaw a fraction harder, or let the breath go a little quick through the nose, or let the eyes harden, given the man some small sign that the words had landed, because the young want to be known to have heard, want it understood that they are choosing to bear it. Halloran gave nothing. There was no color, no tightened jaw, no quickened breath. The words went into him and were simply absorbed, the way a deep, heavy flywheel absorbs a knock without changing its turn. You do not learn to do that on a parade ground. You learn it in a place where flinching costs you something you cannot afford to lose, and you practice it until your body forgets how to flinch at words at all, because it is saving the flinch for things that matter. That is what I saw. I saw a man so disciplined that an insult could not reach the place in him where insults are felt. And I thought again, with more certainty, that one has been somewhere, and this fat man in the blue coat has no idea what he is standing in front of. The chamberlain did not come. The delay went on, and a man like Drain, denied the satisfaction of a flinch, will not let it go. He will push, because the silence has now become a contest. He cannot afford to lose in front of the crowd he has gathered. "Right then," he said, and there was an edge under the bluster now. "If it can stand there like a statue, it can stand there and do its office. I am a member of the order near enough and a baron of this kingdom, and when a man of my rank passes, a guardsman renders the salute. Everyone knows it, so." He stepped square in front of Halloran, set his heels together in a clumsy mockery of attention, and barked, "Salute! Salute the Baron Drain!" Now there was a real silence at the rail. Even the crowd, which understood almost nothing of what it was watching, understood that a line had been stepped over. The young guardsman down the rank did not move, but I saw the nearest of them, a boy of perhaps 25, 2 posts down, go pale and rigid, his eyes sliding sideways without his head turning, and I understood from that small slip that whatever was happening, it was outside the day's order entirely, and the young man did not know what was meant to happen next. A guardsman of the RoyalGuard does not render a salute to a private person on his own demand. The salute is a thing of the service. It is given to the king, to the colors, to the senior officers of the regiment, on the proper occasions and the proper command, and to no one else, and certainly not to a foundry baron who has worked himself into a temper because the chamberlain is late. Halloran knew this better than anyone in the square. I would later understand better than the chamberlain, better than the men who would come out of the palace in their gold braid. He had spent his life inside these rules. And so when Calloway Drain stood in front of him and ordered him to salute, the guardsman did the only thing the rules and his own iron permitted. He held. The far stare did not waver. The folded hands did not lift. He did not salute, and he did not explain, and he did not so much as let the man see that the order had reached him at all. That refusal, silent, total, perfectly within his right, was the thing Drain could not forgive. He had a crowd. He had asked for a salute and been given a wall. And a man who has spent his life being agreed with cannot stand to be walled, especially before an audience, because in that moment the audience is watching to see whether the great man is truly great or only loud. So Drain did the thing that turned the morning. He reached out with his gloved hand, and he struck the brim of the guardsman's tall black cap, a sharp, flat, contemptuous flick, hard enough to tip it back half an inch on Halloran's head and snap the chin strap tight against the old scar on his jaw, and he said into the guardsman's face, "There. Did that wake you up? Will the ornament move now?" I heard the crowd draw breath all along the rail. I heard the old woman beside me say low, "Oh, he should not have done that." I felt my own hand close hard on the cold iron, and I watched the cap settle back a half-inch askew on a man who had not flinched, and I watched Mayor Halloran not move. He did not move. I cannot say it plainly enough, because the not moving was the whole of it. A blow to the cap of a guardsman of the RoyalGuard is not a small thing. It is a touch laid on the king's own service, and there were 8 armed men in that square who would have been within their standing orders to answer it. The young guardsman 2 posts down had his knuckles white on his rifle. But Halloran, who had every right and every reason and every weapon, did nothing at all except, very slightly, so slightly that I think I was the only one at the rail who caught it, straighten his neck and let the cap find its own seat again, so that within a breath it sat true once more, and the man under it stood exactly as he had stood, eyes forward, hands folded, as though Calloway Drain had laid his glove against a statue after all and found, to his confusion, that it was made of something harder than he was. And that, I think, was the moment Drain began to lose, though he did not yet know it, because the crowd had been with him in a small way at the start, a baron, a delay, a bit of fun at the expense of a stuffed soldier. People will go along with that. But you cannot strike a man who will not strike back and keep a crowd. There is something in ordinary people that turns, hard and all at once, when they see the powerful lay hands on the disciplined, and the disciplined refuse to be provoked. The fun went out of the rail like heat out of a doused fire. I heard mutters. I heard a man behind me say, "Now that's not right at all." Drain, flushed and breathing hard from his own performance, looked around for the laughter he had grown used to and found a wall of frowning faces. And for the first time that morning, a flicker of something other than certainty crossed his red face. He did not understand it. He understood only that the room had changed, and he did not know why. And a man who does not understand why the room has changed will always do the wrong thing next, because he reaches for more of what worked before. So he leaned in close to Halloran, close enough that I could no longer hear the words from the rail, and said something short and low and ugly, with his finger up near the guardsman's chest. And then he stepped back and turned to his son and said, loudly, recovering his bluster, "When I am a brother of the order this afternoon, I will have a word about the quality of the men they post at this gate. Ornaments. The whole regiment, ornaments and pensioners." And he laughed, and his son laughed, and the secretary smiled the thin smile of a man who is paid to smile, and the crowd at the rail did not laugh at all. I stood there with my bad knee against the iron and my case at my feet, and I will tell you what was happening in me, because it bears on the end of this. I was angry, the slow, cold anger of an old soldier who has watched a man dishonor the uniform and cannot lift a finger to answer it. But under the anger something else was working. I was looking at Merc Halloran, at the seamed jaw, at the far stare that had not so much as twitched through all of it, at the metal ribbons across his breast. And I was trying to read the ribbons, the way an old soldier will, because the ribbons are a man's whole history written in colored silk if you know the language. And among the row of them, set first, in the place of precedence on the left, where a man wears the highest thing he owns, there was a ribbon I knew. Black with a single thread of crimson through the center. I had not seen it on a living man's chest in my life. I had seen it once, in a glass case in the regimental hall at Ederton, beneath a portrait of a man who had not come home. Black with a thread of crimson, the ribbon of the Sable Cross. I did not let myself believe it. There are men who wear ribbons they have no right to, and a cynical part of me said an old guardsman kept on past his prime to make up the ceremonial numbers. Perhaps a clerk gave him a ribbon to fill out the row. But the rest of me, the part that had read his bearing from the first and never once been wrong about it, was very quiet and very sure, and it said no. That ribbon is on that chest because that man earned it, and you are standing 8 feet from something you will tell your grandchildren about. And the fat fool in the blue coat has just struck the cap of the bravest man in the kingdom and called him an ornament. I did not know the whole of it yet. I did not know the name Harrow Ford, or rather I knew it the way everyone in Corvith knew it, a battle, a bridge, a stand, a thing they taught the children. But I did not yet know that the man who had held it was standing in front of me with his cap knocked askew by a railway baron. But I knew the ribbon. And I knew, with a certainty that made the hair stand up on my arms in the clean morning light, that Calloway Drain had made a mistake he could not begin to measure, and that he was about to be shown the size of it in front of the whole court. It was perhaps a quarter of an hour more before the palace doors opened, the long, deliberate quarter hour of a court that does nothing quickly. And in that time, Drain recovered his confidence the way such men do, by talking himself back up. He had decided, I think, that the silence of the guardsman had been a victory after all, that he had cowed the ornament, and he stood with his thumbs in his waistcoat and held forth to his son about how a firm hand was the only thing the lower orders understood, and how he would see to it, once he was a brother of the order, that standards were restored. He had quite forgotten the turned faces at the rail. He had gone back inside the warm room of his own importance and shut the door, and he stood there pleased with himself while the morning gathered itself, all unknown to him, into the shape that would undo him. Then the great central doors of Ravensmoor opened, and the chamberlain came out, and behind the chamberlain, on the broad top step, came the king. I had never seen the king of Corvith in the flesh. Most men never do. He was younger than I had imagined and plainer, a spare, upright man in a dark uniform with very little gold on it, which is the surest sign of a man who has no need to prove anything. And he came down the steps without ceremony, talking quietly to an officer at his side, the way a man walks through a place he knows well and need not perform in. The chamberlain had clearly meant to bring the morning's honored guests into the palace. Instead, the king had chosen to come out into the court, to walk the line of the wall guard as he passed, which I gathered from the murmur around me was a thing he did when the mood took him, being a soldier himself before he was a king. The crowd at the rail went down into a kind of hush, and the guardsmen, all 8 of them, came in the same instant to the present, the rifles up. The smart crack of 8 pairs of heels, all 8 but the inner man on the right, who, I understood a moment later, was already at the proper position for his rank and station and waited, motionless, for the king to reach him. The king came down the line slowly. He stopped here and there. He said a word to one young guardsman, a longer word to another, the easy private words of a commander who knows that the men in the ranks are men and not furniture, the very thing Calloway Drain had never once in his life understood. And Drain, seeing the king approach, did what such men do. He stepped forward from his little party, swelling again, arranging his face into its most distinguished expression, certain that the king had come out to greet the new Baron Drain, the kingdom's newest brother of the Sable Cross, the man of consequence whose iron had built the eastern provinces. He had positioned himself, you see, directly beside the right-hand sentry post, beside Halloran, so that the king, coming down the line, would arrive at the guardsman and the baron together. Drain meant to be greeted there. He had set his stage. The king reached the end of the line. He came to the inner post on the right, and he stopped. He stopped in front of the older guardsman with the seamed jaw, and for a moment he simply looked at him, and the easy commander's manner with which he had walked the rest of the line went out of his face and was replaced by something quieter and far heavier. The whole court had gone silent, the kind of silence that has weight in it, that presses on the ears. And into that silence the King of Corvith said, in a voice pitched low but perfectly clear in the still air, words I have carried in my chest ever since. "Colonel Halloran," he said. Not guardsman, not soldier, colonel. And then the King of Corvith, in front of his whole court, in front of the chamberlain and the officers in their gold and the railway baron in his fine blue coat, and the six-deep crowd at the rail and one old clockmaker from Edderton with his hand frozen on the iron, did a thing I will not forget if I live another 60 years. He brought his own hand up, the king's own hand, and he saluted the man at the gate. "I did not look to find you on the line this morning, Colonel," the king said, lowering the salute. "They tell me you ask for the gate. Every year they offer you the regiment, the staff, a seat at any table in the kingdom, and every year you ask to keep the gate. I have stopped arguing with you about it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, grave and warm at once. "Harrow Ford keeps its own counsel, I suppose. It always did." Harrow Ford. The word went through the crowd like a current through water. I heard it taken up and passed along the rail in a rising murmur. Harrow Ford. That's Halloran, the bridge, the one who held the bridge. And I understood that the whole story was arriving in the minds of the crowd all at once. The thing the children were taught, the stand at the bridge in the worst hour of the Vale River campaign. When a colonel and the broken remnant of his command had held a crossing for 2 days and a night against everything thrown at them, so that an army and the better part of 3 towns full of people could get clear behind them. And how of all the men who began that stand only a handful had walked off the bridge at the end of it. And how the kingdom had struck the sable cross, its highest thing, the black ribbon with the thread of crimson, and given it to the colonel who held the line. And how that colonel had never once after the war stood up to be honored for it, had refused every post and every seat and every dinner, and had asked, only and always, to be allowed to keep a quiet watch at a gate. The whole of it, arriving in the silent court in the space of a few breaths. And the man it was all about stood under his tall black cap with his hands folded on his rifle and his eyes forward, exactly as he had stood when Calloway Drain struck his brim and called him stuffing, and gave no more sign of the king's salute than he had given of the baron's glove, for he was a soldier in the king's presence on duty, and the discipline that would not bend for an insult would not bend for praise either. That was the thing. That was the whole man. He had taken the dishonor and the honor with the same unmoved face, because to a man like that they were both only weather, and the post was the post. And Calloway Drain, standing not 3 feet away in his fine blue coat with his distinguished face, arranged for the greeting that was never going to come, heard all of it. I watched it land on him. I have watched a great many delicate mechanisms come apart over the years, and there is a particular moment when a thing that has been wound too tight and built too cheap finally gives, and I saw that moment cross the baron's red face. The certainty went out of it first, the way the light goes out of a window, then the color, draining down from the brow so that the broad face went gray and slack around the heavy gold chain. He understood. Slowly, and then all at once, he understood what he had done, that the ornament he had mocked before the crowd, the stuffing he had ordered to salute him, the pensioner whose cap he had struck with his glove to make the statue jump, was the living holder of the sable cross, the man whose valor was the very thing the Order Drain had bought his way toward existed to honor. He had come to the vain court that morning to be made, for money, a brother of an honor that this silent old man had bought in blood at a bridge. And he had spent the hour beforehand striking that man's cap and calling him furniture in front of the whole city. The king had not so much as glanced at Drain through any of it. But the king missed nothing. I am sure now that he had seen the whole of the Baron's performance from the steps, the way a good commander sees the whole field, and that his coming out to walk the line had not been chance at all. He turned, unhurried, and let his eyes rest on Calloway Drain for the first time, and he said, in the same low, clear voice, with no anger in it whatever, which was somehow far worse than anger, "Baron Drain, is it? You are down for the order this morning." "Your Majesty," Drain managed. The bluster was entirely gone. The voice that had filled the court was a thin and scraping thing now. "Your Majesty, the man would not answer me, He is not permitted to answer you," the king said. "He is on duty at my gate. He is not permitted to answer you, and he is not permitted to strike you, and he is not permitted to render you a salute you have not earned. And he did none of those things, because he is the most disciplined soldier in my kingdom, which is a thing you might have read in his bearing if you had ever in your life learned to look at a man and see what he is." He let that sit. The court was utterly silent. "The Order of the Sable Cross," the king went on, "exists to honor men like the one whose cap you struck. I had been told you were a fit man to join their company. I find this morning that I was misinformed." He turned to the chamberlain. "The Baron's name will be withdrawn from this morning's investiture," he said, quite quietly, as a man gives an order he does not expect to repeat. He may apply again when he has understood the difference between an honor that is bought and an honor that is earned, if he ever does. And then, to Drain, with a courtesy more terrible than any rebuke, "Good morning to you, Baron. The gate you have been blocking is for the use of those with business inside it. You have none." There was no shouting. No one laid a hand on Calloway Drain. He was not arrested, not struck, not disgraced with any noise at all. He was simply, with a few quiet words, set outside the thing he had spent his money and his maneuvering to get inside, and shown to be exactly what he was, in front of the whole court and the whole crowd, by a king who never once raised his voice. That is the cleanest ruin I have ever watched fall on a man. He stood a moment more on the pale stones, gray-faced, the gold chain rising and falling on his chest, and then his son took his arm, and the secretary went gray and silent before them, and the three of them walked back across the wide court to the glossy black carriage with the too much brass on it, and the crowd at the rail did not jeer them and did not laugh, which was the worst of all, because a man can bear to be jeered. What Calloway Drain could not bear, and what he carried out of the vain court with him that morning, was the silence of several hundred ordinary people who had watched him strike a hero and call him stuffing, and who now understood exactly what they had seen, and had nothing whatever to say to him about it. The Greys took the brass carriage out the side lane, and the morning closed over the place where he had stood as water closes over a dropped stone. The king turned back to the line. He looked again at Halloran for a moment, and I think there passed between them something I had no right to and could not read, the private regard of two men who had both, in their different stations, been to the kind of place that makes a man able to stand still under any weather at all. "Keep your gate, Colonel," the king said, very low, almost gently. "The kingdom sleeps better for knowing you are on it." And then he went up the steps and into the palace, and the chamberlain and the officers went in after him, and the morning's true business, whatever it was, went on inside without the Baron Drain. The 8 guardsmen came down from the present to the order, the rifles grounding with a single soft crack, and the crowd at the rail let out its long-held breath and began, slowly, to talk again, and to drift, and to point, and to tell one another the story they had just watched as though they had each understood it from the start. But I did not drift. I stood at the iron with my case at my feet and my bad knee aching, and I looked at Mayor Halloran, who had gone back to exactly what he had been before any of it: the folded hands, the far stare, the straight back, the cap sitting true on his head, a still red figure at the dark mouth of the arch. The king's salute had moved him no more than the baron's glove. He had taken the highest honor a man can be paid, the salute of his sovereign before the whole court, with the same unmoved face he had given to the worst insult of the morning, And now he stood his post as though nothing in the world had happened, because to him, I think, nothing had. The post was the post. The weather was only weather. There was a gate to keep, and a man had asked every year of his life only to be allowed to keep it. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since. We make a noise about honor in this kingdom. We strike crosses and we hold investitures, and we build orders and almshouses, and we let men of great wealth pay their way into the company of the brave. And we tell ourselves the ribbon is the thing, the seat is the thing, the title rolled like a coin on the tongue is the thing. And then once in a long while, you stand at a rail on a bright morning, and you watch a railway baron in a fine blue coat strike the cap of a quiet old soldier and call him an ornament. And you watch the soldier not move, and you learn the truth of it, which is that the honor was never in the ribbon at all. The honor was in the man who would not flinch, not for the insult and not for the praise, not for the glove and not for the king's own salute, because the discipline that holds a bridge for 2 days, so that the towns behind it can empty, is the same discipline that holds a gate on an ordinary morning, and it does not turn itself on and off for the size of the occasion. Callaway Drain could buy his way toward the name of the thing. He could never have bought the thing itself, and the proof of it was that he could not even recognize it when it stood 8 feet in front of him in a red coat, because the thing itself does not announce itself, does not demand the salute, does not roll its title on its tongue. It only keeps the gate. I caught my train home to Edgerton that afternoon with the empty flannel in my case and the morning sitting in my chest like a coal. I never spoke to Mayor Halloran. I never could have. He was on duty and I was nobody. And there was nothing for me to say to him that the king had not already said better. But I went and stood at the rail for an hour more before I left, and I watched him keep his gate, and I rendered him, in my own way, the only honor an old line sergeant has to give, which is to stand a little straighter himself for having seen it. And when at last I turned to go, I will tell you the truth. I came to attention there at the iron rail, an old man with a bad knee and a clockmaker's case, and I brought my hand up, the way I had not done in 30 years, and I held the salute a moment to the still red figure at the gate who would never see it and would not have moved if he had. Then I picked up my case and went home. The Baron Drain, I heard later, never did apply again. The Order of the Sable Cross, I am told, admitted no more patrons after that morning. The king saw to it that the only road into that company runs through the kind of place that gives a man a black ribbon with a thread of crimson, and the kind of bearing that an old soldier can read across a forecourt, and a fat baron cannot read at arm's length. And Colonel Merk Halloran, last living holder of the Sable Cross, hero of the bridge at Harrow Ford, kept his gate at the Vane Court for as long as his knees would let him, and asked for nothing else, and got at the end exactly the thing he had spent his life refusing to be given, to be left in peace at his post, a quiet man doing the hardest work in the square, which is to stand still and not flinch, and to be in the only way that has ever mattered. Unmistakably and entirely the real thing.